The Bible is part of the world's treasure of ancient myths. The stories in the Bible, all the characters in those stories are myths. They are part of a precious inheritance around the world of ancient myth, and they are not about flesh and blood historical figures. This can be shown beyond a doubt. They are part of a precious inheritance, and yet, for the past 1700 plus years, humanity has been told, no, these are historical stories, they're not myth. That is cutting ourselves off from the precious ancient wisdom by a small group of people who want to take these stories as if they're about flesh and blood people. They are the ungrateful heirs of this precious inheritance of myth who have said, no, we're not part of the family, the world family. We're different. We've got truth and everyone else has myth. Wrong. The stories in the Bible are not about flesh and blood historical figures, and they can be shown to be myth. In fact, they can be shown to be star myth, celestial myth, based on celestial metaphor, part of this same system of celestial metaphor that forms the foundation, the structure for the myth system that is found around the world. It is not about flesh and blood. A lot of times I say literalist and literalism. That's kind of a clunky, awkward word to say. People's gears of their heads start to turn, like, what exactly is literalism? What literalism means is believing that there's such a thing as a flesh and blood Moses or a flesh and blood Jesus. And you cannot prove those things. In fact, you can prove that they are not flesh and blood, they're mythical. In fact, the epistles written by Paul, which are included in the Bible, even though Paul was almost certainly a gnostic who understood these stories in an esoteric and a gnostic way. In other words, that they're metaphor, talking about something that's going on in our life, not talking about literalistic flesh and blood. Paul, his writings were almost certainly co-opted and tried to twist it. The flesh and blood literalists tried to twist his writings into supporting them by some clumsy additions, but we can see from his writings that he was against that. He was dead set against that, and I've got some videos that talk about that you can check out. In the epistle, the letter of Paul, that's called the letter of Paul to the Galatians, he says, these things are an allegory. He comes right out and he's talking about the two wives of Abraham and the two sons of Abraham, and he says, these things are an allegory. Abraham is an allegory. The two wives stand for different things. These things are an allegory. He says, for it is written that Abraham hath two sons in Galatians 4:22, and then continuing that same thought, he says, which things are an allegory. Galatians 4:24. I've got here a picture of Moses. We can show the same thing for Abraham, but I'm going to show it for Moses. He is not a flesh and blood character. He is a mythical figure who represents something allegorical, something esoteric, something that is a metaphor for us to understand and apply to our own life, not flesh and blood. The same can be shown for the figure of Jesus in the myths that make up what is called the New Testament. It is not about a flesh and blood Jesus. And in that same letter to the Galatians, Paul starts to get angry and he says, are ye so foolish? Having begun in the Spirit, are ye now made perfect by the flesh? The understanding of that has been twisted all out of proportion by the proponents of a flesh and blood Jesus. But what he's talking about is these are spiritual stories, and now you're trying to make them into flesh stories about a flesh and blood Jesus? What are you doing? You started off on the right path. How have you gone so far astray? It is not about flesh and blood. So let's take a look at, briefly, some evidence that just shows this beyond doubt. We could do this all the way through the stories collected into the Bible and show that they're part of this worldwide system. I'll just pick a few for illustration purposes. I mentioned Moses. This is a painting depicting the crossing of the Red Sea. It's a very interesting painting, and it is absolutely celestial, and it shows the esoteric meaning of the figure of Moses. He is not a historical flesh and blood figure. He is a mythical figure. He is a celestial figure. And let's take a look at the figure of Moses. If you don't see where he is in this painting right away, look at the parting of the Red Sea on the left. You can see the armies of Pharaoh are trying to follow through the gap in the Red Sea, and the Red Sea is about to close over them. And Moses is standing on a rock or a mount, a promontory, a rocky promontory there over the Red Sea, and he's holding out a staff or a rod. Now look at the stars of the sky. Look at the Red Sea, the way that the artist has angled the Red Sea and the passage through the Red Sea, and even the clouds. It evokes the Milky Way. I'm showing the Milky Way in the stars. I'll take away the outline so you can see. I hope you can see the glorious Milky Way there. This is a very important part of the Milky Way. This is the brightest and the widest part of the Milky Way. Scientists believe this is the actual center of our galaxy, and we'll talk about what important feature is there that contributes to this story, but it is very important in the myths of the world and in the stories of the Bible, which are part of this incredible ancient system. Now let's look at the outline of Moses. Go back to the painting now and look at Moses. I'm going to outline him there. He's holding his staff out over the Red Sea. It's actually protruding into the Red Sea a little bit, and then the Red Sea is parting. And let's look back at the stars. Let me show you the figure in the sky, in the heavens, a very important constellation that plays the role of Moses in the stories of the Bible. This is the constellation known as Ophiuchus. Ophiuchus means the serpent bearer. You can see the outline of the constellation itself has a central body that's shaped almost like an obelisk or a pillar or a tombstone, and on either side is what looks like a serpent, a big serpent being held by the serpent bearer Ophiuchus. Ophiuchus plays the role of very important figures in this ancient worldwide system of myth, and often those figures will be holding a staff or a spear or a rod, or sometimes even two spears, because of those serpent halves. They don't always play a serpent. Now, interestingly enough, in the case of Moses, his staff or rod does sometimes turn into what? A serpent. It turns into a serpent. This is a statue from a different mythical figure. In ancient Greece, there's a mythical figure who's also associated with the same constellation named Asclepius. Asclepius has a rod with a serpent entwined about it, but he's certainly an Ophiuchus figure as well, Asclepius. So this is across the different myths of the world, but one or the other side of the two serpent halves of Ophiuchus will often be a rod or a staff. Now, let's just move that out of the way. You can see why that particular side of the serpent halves of Ophiuchus is known as the serpent's head. The side with that little triangular part, that's the serpent's head. But the other side, the serpent's tail, Ophiuchus is holding that staff or that rod right out into the Milky Way. Can you see the Milky Way that we outlined before? And in fact, in the Milky Way itself, in this brightest central part of the Milky Way, there's a very distinctive dark rift. It's called the dark rift, and it goes right across, and it makes a path across the Milky Way, and Ophiuchus is standing right there with a rod or staff extending into the Milky Way right at that dark rift. And I assure you, it goes all the way across, just like the Red Sea was parted. The dark rift leads across the Milky Way, so you can go across it without getting your feet wet. That's where this story comes from. Now, it's very interesting that this artist has depicted the figure of an angel above Moses. And the outline and posture of that angel actually evokes a constellation that's directly above Ophiuchus, another very important constellation, the constellation Hercules. The constellation Hercules often plays a figure of the most powerful god in any myth system, the figure of Zeus, the figure of the God of the Bible. In this case, it's an angel, and sometimes the figure of Hercules will play the role of an angel. And what this is hinting at is the esoteric, deeper meaning of this story. This story is not about a historical occurrence with flesh and blood people. This story is a profound metaphor for us to understand. And this painting makes it very clear, really helps us to understand what's going on here. Down below Ophiuchus is the path of the ecliptic, the path that the sun, moon, and planets go through. And the path of the ecliptic goes through the background stars known as the zodiac. The zodiac constellations are those constellations that the sun, moon, and planets pass through on the path of the ecliptic. And Ophiuchus actually dips down into the ecliptic. You can see that Ophiuchus, the path of the ecliptic, does cut through one of the feet of the figure of Ophiuchus. But Ophiuchus is in the zodiac, but not of the zodiac. Left out of the zodiac, Ophiuchus is this boundary figure who connects earth and heaven, is the intermediary between the divine and this worldly realm that we're in that's depicted by the zodiac. Moses is the one who can intermediate with God or the divine realm. Moses gets the word from the divine. The figure of Ophiuchus and Ophiuchus figures will often be the intermediary between the realm of our lives here in this mortal plane, represented by the zodiac, and the divine realm, which is up the Milky Way, and that's where we find the figure of Hercules. In this case, the figure of Hercules becomes this divine angel standing over Moses. So you can see how Ophiuchus is this intermediary between the invisible realm, the divine realm, and the zodiac realm, the realm of our existence. This is the way this system works. Now look at the painting. The artist has actually, I'll put in some of the names of the zodiac constellations: Sagittarius, Scorpio, Libra. In this part of the sky, the zodiac goes all the way around 360, but the Milky Way at this particular point runs in between Sagittarius and Scorpio, and Virgo is off to the right. But if you look at the artist, the painting, the artist has actually arranged the painting to where we've got the zodiac, or the zodiac figures are along that kind of ecliptic in the painting, and Moses is above on a mound and connecting the intermediary between the people and the divine realm. And you can have some fun looking at the painting and trying to decide, is the artist putting in some zodiac figures here? There's one that's really clear I'm going to outline here. This woman here nursing her baby in that posture. Off to the right, just off to the right, we can barely see the feet of the constellation Virgo, but let me just bring in, this is the constellation Virgo in that particular posture, and the constellation Virgo will often be envisioned as a mother nursing a baby. And that star that is representative of her outstretched arm that I've just circled there, it's called Vinda Beatrix. That star is associated with the baby that Virgo figures are often nursing at their breast. And so you can clearly see that the artist has depicted some zodiac figures down below Moses. Moses is the intermediary between the divine realm and the realm that's represented by the zodiac. These things are an allegory. It's actually talking about our own life. We have these different characteristics that come from the zodiac or that are associated with different aspects of the zodiac, and some of us have more Sagittarius, and some of us have more Scorpio, and some of us have more Libra, but we all have a hidden, suppressed, excluded self, our deeper self, that is depicted in the myths often by an Ophiuchus figure who's not really part of the zodiac, different, along down here in the zodiac, but in a way above, our higher self that connects us to the divine realm. This is how we get the messages from the divine, just like Moses, just like that inspiration that you can't explain, that sometimes defies the, quote, laws of physics that we get taught. There are messages and impulses and inspirations that we get that cannot be explained, that come from the divine realm. That is what these myths are showing. They're dramatizing this. So we can see this over and over in the stories of the Bible. Here's David. We can see that David is a figure who is not a flesh and blood figure. He is a mythical figure. The son of David is Solomon. Solomon, in this painting here, is sitting in between the pillars, and he's giving the judgment of Solomon. These are celestial figures. They can be shown to be celestial figures. David, beyond any doubt, is associated with the constellation Hercules. Now, Solomon is the son of David. So he's descended from David. Solomon is descended from David. And in the sky, the location of Ophiuchus figures will often be descended from Hercules figures. Ophiuchus plays Solomon in between the pillars, and David plays Hercules, and Ophiuchus is Solomon descended from David. That's why Solomon builds the temple. And I go into all this in a lot more detail in my online courses, the Celestial Bible Tour Part 1 and Celestial Bible Tour Part 2, where I go through in abundant detail talking about how Moses is an Ophiuchus figure, and David and Solomon. I go into all the evidence, and it's just overwhelming. So I'll finish this up by saying these are metaphor, these are esoteric, and we'll finish up by looking briefly at the figure of Jesus. It's the same pattern going on. Jesus is the intermediary between earth and heaven. He is an Ophiuchus figure. He is the higher self. He is dramatizing to us this higher self, or this excluded, suppressed, buried aspect of who we are, that actually when we get in touch with higher self and put higher self in charge, that's when we enable ourselves to connect with who we really are and be who we really want to be, and have connection not just with others but with our own self. It opens up connection with others, and it opens up connection with nature and with the divine realm. So this is a very profound subject, and we can see that Jesus, here's a triptych or a triple painting showing the crucifixion scene. There's lots of other stories we could look at, but just briefly, artistically, we can see very clearly. Look at how the fact that Jesus being crucified in between two thieves is painted in this artwork of the crucifixion scene. You see how the two thieves on either side are often painted in these very distorted, contorted, extreme poses and postures. Well, that's because the figure of Jesus, he's also an Ophiuchus figure, and on either side, look at the two serpent halves. He's crucified in between the two thieves. they're all twisted on either side, but in the center you have that very recognizable cross shape in the center of Ophiuchus. And once again, the figure of Jesus is an Ophiuchus figure. He's down here with us, but connected to the divine realm and acts as our intermediary, our connection to the realm of the gods, the realm of the divine, the realm of the invisible realm. Once again, the zodiac signs are down below, and the artist has painted figures who are evocative of the different constellations of the zodiac. I'll just point one out who's really clear to me as a Scorpio figure down at the base of the cross. We often see scorpion symbology in this artwork at the base of the cross because the constellation of Ophiuchus is positioned directly above Scorpio in the sky, and the cross itself runs right down to basically the heart of the scorpion in the constellation Scorpio, the star Antares. So these things are an allegory. These things are esoteric. It is not about a flesh and blood Jesus. And you cannot make it about a flesh and blood Jesus, or you will miss the message. And it can be quite tragic to externalize this message and turn it into something about historical figures, because not only do you miss the message, but it turns out to set you up for all kinds of problems. I talk about this in my most recent book, Invoking the Ancient Gods in You. These are about truths that have to do with each and every one of us, not about something that's external and about some other historical flesh and blood person. It's about you. You're a real flesh and blood person. It's about you, and the figures in the myth are there to tell you about yourself. Tell me about myself. Now, if you want to try and make them into a flesh and blood story about historical figures, I believe you're heading down a potentially dangerous path, but as long as you do it without hurting anybody, not using it as an excuse to hurt others. However, taking these stories literally has historically been used as an excuse to try to convert and to try and oppress and to try and steal, and not just try, but actually to steal the lands of other flesh and blood men and women, and to say, well, they don't matter as much because these stories that I'm taking literally give me the quote unquote right to do that falsely used to try and falsely justify unjust, criminal, illegal seizures and murders and killings. And that has happened around the world, in the Americas, in the continent of Australia, New Zealand, Africa, over and over. And today it is still being used to try and justify what cannot be justified. The second-class citizenship, or not even second class, of a whole host of people who historically lived in the land of Palestine, and then people coming in and saying, no, this belongs to the Jewish people because of the literal stories in the Bible that are being taken literally, wrongly. Israel doesn't have a constitution, but in 2018, they wrote down something called the Basic Law. It still isn't a constitution. They don't have a constitution. And if you go to their website today, they've restricted access to it. You can't find it on the Knesset website anymore, or at least I was blocked when I tried to actually go to the source document. But here's a translation from the 2018 Basic Law of Israel, which declares right in the very first point number 1, Part A, the land of Israel is the historical homeland of the Jewish people in which the state of Israel was established. How are they claiming that it's the historical homeland of the Jewish people? There is no basis for that other than going to the Bible and trying to take it as if it's history about flesh and blood people, which it is not. And then down in part C it says, the exercise of the right to national self-determination in the state of Israel is unique to the Jewish people. So it's only for the Jewish people, and that means that all the other people who are there, who aren't Jewish, they don't have the same rights as everybody else. That's called an apartheid state. That's called a racist setup. That's called saying that some people have more rights than others. Is that okay? It's not okay. That has been tried before, and it's not okay. It was the Confederate States of America said we have a right to create our own confederacy, and we can have slavery there, and you can't stop us. And Abraham Lincoln said, no, you can't. And there was a whole civil war fought about that. And the Confederacy had to be changed. It didn't have an inherent right to exist and do whatever it wanted, even though the people in support of the Confederacy tried all kinds of false justification for what they were doing, including pointing to the Bible. But we've already been through this. The Confederacy had to go. It didn't have a right to exist, and it didn't have a right to treat some men and women as if they had no rights, whereas other men and women did have a right, including the right to live. Taking away the rights of others, you can't do that and say, oh, I'm justified in doing that. But there are people who, following a literalist interpretation of the Bible, believe that falsely justifies, and it's still going on today, and it's completely on the wrong side of history. But here's a screenshot from just a few minutes ago. I took this screenshot from this website it's basically an American website, Christians United for Israel. It's primarily Christian evangelicals who take the Bible literally. In other words, they believe it's about a flesh and blood Jesus, and that all the stories in the Old Testament are about flesh and blood history. And the whole premise of this website is that anyone who's against the current setup is racist or anti-Semitic, and it says, oh, we're going to stand up against anti-Semitism. And apparently they're claiming they have over 10 million Christians who are standing up and speaking for Israel, i.e. Israel can do whatever it wants and you can't criticize it because that's against the Bible and it makes you anti-Semitic, which is completely false. What Israel is doing right now is absolutely war crimes. And I learned all about war crimes when I was in West Point, and we were shown the movie Breaker Morant over and over and over and told you're not allowed to obey illegal orders. Even if you're told that it's okay to shoot prisoners, you can't do that. It was drilled into us. It doesn't matter what the superior officers are saying, oh, this is the policy. So anyone who is inflicting this genocide on the people of Gaza and the West Bank, for that matter, they're obeying illegal orders. They're deliberately inflicting famine on the people of Gaza. They're deliberately targeting hospitals. Those are all war crimes, and it's clearly a genocide. They're trying to clear Gaza. Now they're coming right out and saying we want to move all the Palestinians to Africa or somewhere else. That's exactly it's the definition of a genocide. But 10 million Christians are supporting this. The whole population of Israel is under 10 million. That's counting the Palestinians as well. Obviously, there's fewer Palestinians now after this horrific genocide that's been going on. And yet, those people, they're following a mistaken interpretation. The Bible is not about literal flesh and blood Abraham who has two sons. Those things are an allegory. It's not about a literal story of an Exodus and a literal flesh and blood Moses. Those things are an allegory. And they're not. These stories are not about a flesh and blood Jesus. This is a very important subject to understand. It's as important to understand today as ever. And it's important to keep speaking out on this subject, because this misunderstanding has been used to falsely try and justify what can't be justified in the past, and it is falsely being used again today to try and falsely justify what is absolutely unjustifiable and criminal and illegal.